Our Old Testament reading and preaching text can be found in Daniel chapter 5, verses 17 through 31. If you are with us here in the sanctuary today, that can be found in the Pew Bible on Old Testament page 826. As we've done several times in the book of Daniel, I'm going to begin with some comments that come based on what happens earlier in this chapter, and then when we get to the point where the part that we're going to read picks up, we'll read that and go forward. When we are all at our end, what are we going to think matters? I've been there with several people multiple times, and it is the honor of my life to be invited into your family situations at some of the hardest times your families have faced. Together we share tears, we call on God to our place of pain, and we hope. It might surprise people how often at these moments hope is profound. But at times like these, often there is great hope. Because all that God has built into us, all of the trust that has happened from the difficulties we face, play out in these moments and make us trust in new and more powerful ways. In our text today, there is great trouble in the land. The Medes and Persians are moving their vast armies towards Babylon. Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, is the king now in charge. Theologians and historians argue about if Belshazzar is actually the real king at this time, or if he's just kind of been left in power as Nebuchadnezzar took off when he saw what was coming. Either way, fear is in the air. And Belshazzar decides to do what a lot of kings and a lot of others that are facing doom do. He tries to escape in a bottle. He throws a party. And after he gets all liquored up, he decides to relive some of Babylon's glory. He calls for the gold and silver vessels that Babylon stole from the temple in Jerusalem when they conquered the Jewish kingdom. He and his guests drink from them and praise the gods of silver, bronze, gold, iron, wood, and stone. And recognize what Belshazzar is doing at this moment. He is offending the only one that could be of any help to him. And he's calling out to entities that are of no help. As this is going on, immediately a finger appears in their presence and begins to write on the wall. Terrified, Belshazzar calls in his mystics and advisors and says, "What does this mean? What's going on here?" And whoever tells the king what this means and the interpretation of it will be rewarded greatly. You will be dressed in purple. You will have a gold chain around your neck, and you will be third in power in Babylon. But despite the enormity of the reward, no one is able to say what this means. When the queen hears about what's going on, she reminds Belshazzar that his father had someone working in his kingdom named Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, who had an ability to interpret dreams, who had wisdom beyond human means. And so Belshazzar calls him in and tells him what the reward will be for interpreting these words. And now we are in Daniel 5:17 through 31. Then Daniel answered in the presence of the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and let him know the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar kingship, greatness, glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. He killed those he wanted to kill, kept alive those he wanted to keep alive, honored those he wanted to honor, and degraded those he wanted to degrade. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he acted proudly, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and his glory was stripped from him. He was driven from human society, and his mind was made like that of an animal. His dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until he learned that the Most High God has sovereignty over all kingdom of mortals, and sets over whomever he will. And you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of this temple have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or know. But the God in whose power is your very breath, and to whom belong all your ways, you have not honored. So from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made concerning him that he should rank third in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. This is the word of the Lord. Daniel seems different in this text. He doesn't display the political savvy that we've gotten used to. He's blunt and matter of fact. Is this because he's old and just doesn't care at this point? Or maybe like in the movie The Shawshank Redemption, when Red's final time came in front of the parole board, that at this point he just doesn't care. Does this say something about how he feels about this king? Or does this say something about how Daniel views God? Daniel spoke truth to power. He wasn't speaking to the king as someone who saw himself under the king's authority. Daniel sees himself under the authority of God. The God that decimated his country, Judah. The God that kept him alive in the service of a totalitarian dictator. This is where Daniel's focus is. Does that mean the king couldn't do something to hurt Daniel? Not necessarily. Unless God intervenes, this king could do terrible things to Daniel. But Daniel knows where the real power is, and he decides to recognize the authority of this true sovereign king. But while he doesn't seem to care too much for the king, he's very attentive to the strange message and its interpretation. This message begins with a story about the king's father, Nebuchadnezzar. The first point of the story, probably the most important point, was that Nebuchadnezzar accomplished all that he accomplished because of the benevolence of God. Few things are as damaging to faith than the lie of self-sufficiency. It causes us to disregard the advantages we have, our intelligence, our intellect, our unique opportunities, even those disadvantages that in the long run helped us accomplish what we accomplished. Not recognizing that these gifts are from God causes us to miss God and gives us a hardened attitude towards our neighbors when they haven't attained what we attained, or when they didn't do the things the way we thought they should have been done. We should be faithful. We should work hard. Christianity makes the case that there are no self-made humans. To believe so denies the sovereignty of God over our lives. Daniel goes on to say that when Nebuchadnezzar gave in to pride, he lost everything. His mind, his brilliant mind that had accomplished so much, was given over to madness. And this continued until he learned that God was the true ruler of all things, and not he himself. And in what is perhaps the most scathing comment made in this text, Daniel says to Belshazzar, "You knew this. You knew all of this. I'm not telling you anything new. You knew this, and you still chose poorly." We love excuses, don't we? I didn't know. How could I have known? Daniel stops any excuse by saying, "You knew. You did know." And now, when Belshazzar is leading a group by defiling the vessels stolen from the temple in Jerusalem, he is following the earlier example of his father and not the more recent example. And he compounds those mistakes by praising the gods of metal, stone, and wood that Daniel points out can't see, can't hear, do not know. And then he goes on to say, "But the God who you belong to and is your very breath, you ignored." There is an episode of the TV show Seinfeld where George Costanza is considering his whole life. And as he looks at what he's accomplished and the decisions he made, he is not impressed by them. And so he decides from this point out, I'm going to decide what's the right thing to do, and I'm going to do the complete opposite. Because in life, when I've decided that this is the right thing to do and I've done that, it hasn't worked out for me. So I'm going to make my best decision, and I'm going to do the opposite. Very soon after that decision, he's in a situation where he meets a woman, and instead of creating some big story about who he is and all these lies about what he's accomplished, he tells her the truth. "I'm unemployed and I live with my parents." She introduces herself and seems interested in him. Then when he's before the owner of the New York Yankees, George Steinbrenner, instead of kissing up to the boss and trying to make something sound really good, he berates him and says, "You have done so many terrible things to the city of New York." Instead of going on the attack, Steinbrenner says, "Hire this man." Doing the opposite resulted in the right thing for George. And while it might be tempting to think that the best response from our text today is to see what Belshazzar does and do the opposite, we know our focus is never supposed to be focused on what humans do, deciding what they do right, how to go forward based on them. What we are supposed to always focus on, what are the actions of God? How do we understand right and wrong based on God? And now comes the time when Daniel needs to tell the king what the writing means. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. These are three very common Hebrew and Aramaic words. They are so common, in fact, that the theologians and commentators think it's very likely that the deep confusion over this message has to do with, we know what these words mean, but what do they mean together? How can there be any meaning in this? Everyone in this room would have been familiar with these words, but no one would have understood how God is using them. Mene is a term that means numbered. And Daniel tells the king that God has numbered the days of your kingdom, and he has brought it to an end. Tekel is a term that means to assess. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. The theologian Joyce Baldwin says, Belshazzar fails to tip the balance and reveals his lack of worth on God's scales. Now I want to take a moment to speak about this briefly. This doesn't mean the goal of our life is to earn favor from God. In fact, we know that that's not possible. But this is one of the many times in the Old Testament where it brings up a problem that'll only be solved by the arrival of Jesus. It speaks to how all of our efforts will fall short. Perez literally means part or half. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. This kingdom will be broken and shared between these two other kingdoms. And it seems to me that Belshazzar's denial is so great that he doesn't even consider what Daniel has asked for him. And he showers him with the gifts that Daniel has said, I don't want. Reflecting on this text, Baldwin says, the world's great empires and the kings that represent them are all subject to God, who makes himself known within the promised land and beyond. Today, I want us to think about how two kingdoms need to be influenced by this text. The first is those that we live in. We might have a situation where the country we live in makes rules that we as Christians cannot follow. Our government could require us to do this or that, and we say we just can't do this or that. If we find ourselves in one of those positions, Daniel will be an important book and an important study because he dealt with these situations as well. But the other situation that could also happen is one of our mission partners in another country could be in a situation where they're instructed that they have to do something. They have to shut down their church, they have to close their ministries, something like that. How does Daniel speak to working with a kingdom that we ultimately don't agree with? But I think the most important kingdom response that is here today has to do with the kingdoms that all of us create around ourselves. We often blame another force or power for doing the evil that is causing all the problems, when in reality we do a pretty good job of that ourselves. We are constantly setting up kingdoms that benefit us and care little about our neighbors or our God. We're regularly overlooking the opportunities that God is given us to be more in line with Him and more in line with His kingdom. We put our faith in the gifts God has given us and not in the God who is the giver. Compared to God, the things that we put our hope and trust in do not see, do not hear, do not know. In October of 1983, the United States government was involved in an invasion of Grenada following a coup that took over that country. And in the process of going into Grenada and taking back control over the country, or giving back control to the rightful leadership, one of the things they were really worried about was the people that had done the coup being able to escape. You know, there's a lot of other islands around, and they could get in and out. So the first thing that the military force that was doing this, mostly the United States Navy, the first thing they did was they controlled everything that was going in or coming out of the island. They stopped flights. They didn't allow any boats in or anything like that. And in the course of, as they were moving towards the island, there was a cigarette boat, one of those big, long power speedboats that was shooting towards the island. They called out to it over the radios. They called out to it over loudspeakers. It still kept heading towards the island. So in time, they fired a cannon right across the bow of that boat. And at that point, the boat turned around and headed away. Chapter 5 of Daniel is a shot across the bow. It reminds us that no kingdom is beyond God's control. And any kingdom, including the many kingdoms that we regularly set up for ourselves, also have an expiration date. All the days of all our kingdoms are numbered, and the sum of all that we have done will be found lacking, but our assets will not be divided up. They will be taken up by the only kingdom that will never end. Like Belshazzar was, worried about the Medes and Persians, but he never really grasped who was in control. Daniel 5 is a shot across the bow of our lives that calls us to live a different way, a way where our hope and trust is in the God who is always in control, even if it doesn't look like it. Let us pray. Gracious God, you create us. You call us to yourself and give us opportunities to serve you and the world around us. We squander those opportunities time and time again. But only because of your love for us, we trust that our lives will not be found wanting. You see and hear and know that no matter how many days we have left, they will be days that you redeem for your glory. Use our lives so they will bring honor to you, and we depend on you to tip your scales when our days are ended. God, we are still in the grip of this disease. Remind us that we are even more in your hands and your care. As we beg you to take from us, we trust in you, even if it doesn't go the way we want. Dethrone our agendas, our entitlement, and our demands, so that we can experience more and more the love and life that you prefer for us. Clear the way so we can follow your Son and demonstrate the good news of your love for all people, believing that your way is the right way, trusting in you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Join us at First Presbyterian Church, Sundays at 11 a.m. in our sanctuary, or live streamed on our website.